Snow hammered the mountainside road so hard it sounded like gravel on a coffin lid. Jonas Hale leaned into the wind, one hand on the rusted guardrail, the other wrapped around the duffel that held everything he owned. His dog Rook should have been glued to his heel in this kind of whiteout. Instead, the shepherd froze, hackles up, head tilted, nose cutting the air like a blade. A low whine slipped from Rook's chest, then he lunged toward the dark slope above the road, away from the faint lights of Jonas's newly inherited cabin, and toward something buried in the snow, something that was ticking. Rook dragged against the leash with a strength Jonas hadn't felt since deployment urgent focused, almost desperate. The wind howled across the ridge, shredding visibility into drifting sheets of white, but the dog didn't hesitate. He planted his paws, stared into the storm, and let out a sharp bark that cut through the cold like a warning flare. Jonas squinted into the swirling dark. Nothing but snow-swept rock and a few bent pines clinging to the slope. No movement, no sound. No reason for Rook to act like the mountain itself had spoken. Easy boy Jonas muttered, tugging lightly. Cabin's the other way. But Rook refused. Another bark, sharper, closer to fear than aggression. A gust tore across the ridge, carving out a brief window of clarity, and Jonas's breath caught. Up the slope, a soft orange glow pulsed beneath a drift faint as a dying ember. Not fire, not natural, a signal, or a warning. Rook braced himself, staring at that buried light, as though time were running out. Jonas swallowed hard, pulse climbing. Whatever waited under that snow, it wasn't part of the inheritance. And turning away suddenly felt like the one mistake he couldn't afford to make. The wind eased only slightly as Jonas Hale and Rook trudged toward the cabin that perched on the shoulder of Blackthorn Ridge. The structure lay hidden behind a line of skeletal birch trees, their branches silvered with frost and clinking softly in the cold like brittle chimes. Jonas had seen photos of the cabin in the lawyer's packet, a grainy exterior shot, faded blue ink dates, but they hadn't prepared him for the real thing. A two-story wooden structure leaned into the mountainside, supported at the rear by stone and old mountain rock. Its roof sloped so sharply it looked like it was bracing against a blow. Lantern light flickered behind fogged window panes, though Jonas hadn't lit anything yet. That unsettled him more than the cold. Rook sniffed the air and gave a short grunt-tail straight posture, wary but not afraid. The dog always knew how to distinguish threat from curiosity. That was more than Jonas could say for himself lately. He stepped onto the porch boards, creaking under his weight. A faded horseshoe hung crooked above the door, a charm that had long since surrendered its promise. Jonas exhaled through numb lips and muttered, "Well, whatever you left me, Grandma Evie, it's still standing." Rook bumped his leg gently, a grounding gesture. Jonas rested his gloved hand briefly on the dog's head, before pushing open the door. Inside, the cold hit different, denser, almost metallic. The air smelled faintly of cedar dust, and something older like damp stone that had been sealed for years. Jonas set his duffel on the floor. His breath rose in soft ghosts as he scanned the space. A wood stove sat cold and dark in the corner, its iron belly frosted. A narrow staircase hugged the far wall leading to an upper loft. Shelves lined with jars, herbs, dried fruit, a few unlabeled powders sat untouched. A long wooden table, scratched and warped with age, held a stack of notebooks bound in twine. But something about the cabin felt occupied, even though every angle suggested abandonment. Rook moved, first padding forward with measured steps. He sniffed the floorboards, the walls, the legs of the table. Then he stopped abruptly at a spot near the back of the room and pressed his nose hard into the wood. Jonas frowned. Again, Rook whined, soft, urgent. Jonas knelt. Nothing looked unusual. No seams, no hinges, not even a shift in the board grain. But the dog seldom misread a trace. Jonas brushed his fingers over the wood. It felt colder than the rest of the floor, unnaturally cold, as if the mountain was breathing through it. He stood and crossed the room, needing to move, needing something familiar to anchor himself. Military habit assessed surroundings before settling. He tugged the cord on a hanging lantern. The flame caught dim and wavering, throwing long shadows across the walls. Jonas ran a hand through his wind-damp hair. He still wasn't used to calling the woman who owned this place Grandma. They'd only met a handful of times, and even those memories were soft and fragmented. Her voice, though, he remembered that. A warm hum, always humming, as if she were keeping rhythm with some private melody. "You'd have liked her," Rook Jonas murmured. "Evie Hale. Lived alone up here. Off-grid. Off everything." Rook's ears twitched, but he remained focused on that one floorboard. Jonas blew out a slow breath. "Yeah, I feel it too." He turned toward the window. Snow drifted past the glass in graceful spirals. Beyond the birches, the ridge sloped sharply into the valley, where the mining lights of the town of Larkspur glowed faintly far enough to look safe, close enough to see the scars carved into the hillsides. Jonas hated mines. They were too similar to caves, and caves held too many memories he'd rather leave buried in the desert halfway across the world. He shrugged off his coat and hung it by the door. His shoulders ached the way they did whenever weather shifted or whenever thoughts lingered too long on the past. Instinctively, he checked Rook's harness. Secure. No frost damage. Good. He dropped into the wooden chair by the table. The wood groaned under his weight. One of the notebooks sat slightly ajar, as if someone had been reading it recently. Jonas pulled it closer. Inside, the handwriting was tight and deliberate, not pretty functional. The ridge is shifting again. Something in the stone is not sleeping. Jonas blinked. That didn't sound like geology. It sounded like superstition. But as he flipped through pages filled with sketches of underground channels, pressure marks, and notes about listening points, he realized Evie had been studying the mountain with an intensity that bordered on obsession. He frowned. What were you trying to hear? A low chuff came from Rook as if echoing the question. Jonas reached down and rubbed behind the dog's ear. Don't start agreeing with the creepy parts. One paranoid hail per family is enough. Rook pushed into his hand, reassuring him. The lantern flickered, brightened, and then steadied. Jonas rose and crossed to the stove, brushing frost off the iron surface. Let's get heat going. Then food. Then maybe we pretend today wasn't strange. He opened the stove's small hatch. A puff of ash drifted out fine and gray. The logs inside were old and brittle but usable. He packed in fresh tinder from the wood box and struck a match. Before the flame reached the kindling, Rook snapped. A sharp bark, short, authoritative. Then the dog shoved Jonas's wrist with surprising force. Hey, Jonas jerked back. What has gotten into smoke burst from the stove mouth, black and thick. Jonas staggered back, coughing. Rook stayed in front of him, eyes locked on the swirling dark plume. Jonas opened the door wide to vent it. The smoke dissipated slowly, revealing the issue the chimney had collapsed inward with packed ice. If he'd let the stove burn, the cabin could have filled with smoke or worse. He crouched beside Rook. Okay, that's twice today you've saved me. Starting to look bad on my record. Rook pressed his forehead against Jonas's chest. Jonas wrapped an arm around the dog's neck, grounding himself in the familiar warmth of fur and breath. This place, Jonas murmured, is hiding more than old memories. He let go gently. When he stood, his gaze drifted again to the window where the light from the mining operation pulsed like a beacon in the valley. He didn't like the timing. He didn't like the coincidence. He didn't believe in coincidence anymore. He pulled a blanket over the chair and sat, exhaustion settling deep into his bones. Rook lay across his boots, a comforting weight. Jonas traced the grain of the table with his fingertips, slow, methodical, letting his thoughts wander despite himself. The mountains had always felt like a refuge when he was young, a quiet place for a quiet kid. But after 2 deployments, too many nights, listening for footsteps or mortar shells, silence had turned into its own kind of enemy. It filled every corner and reminded him of everything he couldn't unsee. Yet here now the quiet didn't feel empty. It felt watchful. Jonas sighed. Why did she leave this to me? Rook's ears flicked. It was a good question. Jonas wasn't the eldest in the family. He wasn't the most responsible. He wasn't even the one who had stayed in touch. So why him? He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small metal key the lawyer had given him. Machined steel, old style, with a tiny etching on the end, 3 straight lines, parallel, barely visible. He turned it over in his hands. You recognize this boy? Rook sniffed it and sneezed sharply. Helpful. He set it down on the table. It made a delicate, unsettling ring against the wood, almost like striking stone. Jonas froze. That sound didn't match the wood. It sounded deeper, hollower, as if beneath the table lay something denser than timber. He leaned down and knocked his knuckles lightly on the floor. Solid. Another spot, solid. Then the place Rook had fixated on. A faint, resonant thunk. Not wood, not air, something between. Okay, Jonas whispered. Now you've got my attention. Rook wagged his tail once, not excited, affirming. Jonas stood and paced, letting the heat of discovery battle the cold in his limbs. He needed answers, but he also needed rest. He needed to be smart, not impulsive. The last time he acted on adrenaline, people got hurt. He wasn't letting instinct be the only guide again. Tomorrow, he said aloud, as if convincing both himself and the dog. We investigate tomorrow. Rook tilted his head, unconvinced. Jonas softened. Fine, you're right. Maybe tonight. But we start by checking the upper level. The dog followed as Jonas climbed the narrow staircase. The steps groaned under his weight. At the top, a small loft opened into a warm-looking sleeping space. A quilt, hand-stitched, old but well-kept, lay, folded at the foot of the bed. A small wooden trunk sat in the corner. Jonas crossed to the trunk and lifted the lid. The hinges squealed. Inside, neatly folded letters rested atop a thick envelope. He picked one up. The handwriting was unmistakably Evie's, sharp and clear. He read aloud softly, "Jonas, when the ridge begins to whisper, follow the sound that doesn't belong to you." Rook let out a quiet, throaty whine. Jonas lowered the letter slowly. This is starting to feel less like an inheritance and more like a summons. He set the letter aside and lifted the thick envelope. Inside were maps hand-drawn, marked with lines that didn't match any standard cartography. Some were labeled quiet routes. Others, stone channels. One, highlighted in deep blue ink, was labeled simply Thread Point. Jonas traced the blue line with a fingertip. The path ran directly beneath the cabin. "Thread Point," he murmured. "Whatever you were studying, Grandma, you weren't doing it casually." He closed the trunk carefully and sat on the edge of the bed. Rook sat beside him, resting his chin on Jonas's knee. Jonas stroked the dog's back absent-mindedly. "Do I run again?" he whispered. Rook lifted his head sharply. Jonas exhaled long and unsteady. "Yeah, I know. I'm tired of running too." The lantern downstairs guttered, sending a faint flicker up the staircase. Jonas shivered. There was no going back to town tonight. No bus route, no warm shelter. This was home now, at least long enough to understand why Evie had left it to him, and why the mountain seemed to care he was here. He stood and moved back down the stairs, Rook close behind. The light from the mining valley still pulsed faintly through the trees like a heartbeat. Jonas locked the front door, placed the key beside the notebooks, and settled by the window with Rook at his feet. Snow thickened soft and unhurried. The cabin creaked as the temperature dropped, old wood responding to the mountain's cold breath. Jonas let his eyes drift shut for a moment, head resting back, shoulders lowering an inch from their habitual tension. "Tomorrow," he whispered, "we start listening." Rook pressed his paw against Jonas's boot in quiet agreement, and beneath the floor, faint and rhythmic, too soft to hear unless one was still, something answered. A pulse, a vibration, a whisper rising through stone. The sound kept him from sleeping. It wasn't loud, just a faint, steady rhythm somewhere under the floorboards. At first, Jonas tried to blame it on pipes settling timbers, anything ordinary. But the cabin had no plumbing left, and the pattern didn't match random noise. It had a cadence, 3 soft thumps. Pause. 2 more, not mechanical, not quite natural either. Rook lay stretched at the foot of the chair, eyes half closed, but Jonas could tell the dog was tracking it too. Every time the rhythm shifted, one ear flicked a tiny, precise movement. "Don't say it," Jonas murmured. Rook opened his eyes fully and pushed himself up, moving with deliberate purpose toward that same spot near the back wall, the place that had bothered him from the moment they'd stepped inside. Of course, Jonas sighed. "You're not letting this go." The dog placed one paw on the board claws, clicking lightly, and glanced back at Jonas with a look he'd come to know well overseas. "We're not done here." Jonas pushed himself to his feet. His back cracked as he straightened. "All right, one look. Then we call it for the night." He grabbed the lantern, its warm light chasing shadows into the corners. Kneeling beside Rook, he pressed his ear to the floor. The wood was cold enough to sting his skin. At first, nothing. Just the soft hush of wind outside. Then the vibration returned. Thump, 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 pause, thump, thump. It felt like someone knocking from far below with a padded fist. Jonas pulled back, pulse ticking faster. "That's not normal," Rook answered with a low, insistent whine. Jonas ran his fingers along the plank, searching for seams. Years of field work had taught him how to spot hidden edges, loose tiles, concealing wires, disturbed dust around hatches. Here the dust told him nothing. Evie had kept this place too clean. But close to the baseboard, his fingertip snagged on a hairline gap. "Got you," he breathed. He fetched his multi-tool from the duffel, flipped open the flat edge, and slid it into the gap. The wood resisted, then gave with a tired creak. A narrow rectangle lifted, revealing not raw earth, but metal, an inset frame with a recessed handle. Jonas stared for a heartbeat. "Your grandmother," he muttered, "was either very cautious or very strange." Rook huffed softly, tail giving a single sweep. Jonas wrapped his fingers around the handle and pulled. The hatch rose with a faint squeal of old metal, exhaling a breath of colder air from below. The smell rising up was different from the cabin's damp, stone mineral tang and the faint bite of machine oil long dried. Lantern light spilled down onto a cramped shaft cut directly into bedrock. Narrow iron rungs descended into shadow. Rook stepped to the edge and peered down, ears, pricked nose working. Jonas swallowed. His body remembered vertical ladders and tight spaces all too well. Heat crept into his chest, not from the room but from memories of concrete stairwells and sirens and shouting in languages he barely understood. He closed his eyes for a second. You're not there. You're here. Different mountain, different war. When he opened them, Rook was watching him. I'm fine, Jonas said, voice rougher than he liked. Just don't love going underground anymore. Rook pressed his head against Jonas's shoulder, a steady grounding weight. The vibration pulsed again, faint but insistent. 3 beats, pause, 2 more. It wasn't getting louder, but it was getting harder to ignore. Jonas hitched a breath. Okay, we look. Then we come back up. If it's nothing, we sleep. If it's something... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. Rook already knew. Jonas hooked the lantern's handle onto a rusty nail inside the hatch, took hold of the first rung and started down. The rock against his gloves was cold, rough, oddly comforting in its solidity. Rook waited until Jonas had descended several steps, then followed, bracing his paws carefully, using the rungs more like a narrow staircase. They'd practiced this in training tunnels, once search and rescue drills for trapped personnel. Rook moved with the same controlled focus now, like the years between hadn't happened. 15 rungs down the shaft opened into a small chamber carved directly into the mountain. Jonas stepped onto the stone floor and turned slowly. The room was no bigger than a single-car garage, but every surface had a purpose. Along the far wall, thick metal plates were bolted into the rock, each connected by cables to a central console that looked like a hybrid of old radio gear and lab equipment. Dials, needle gauges, a narrow oscilloscope screen. A pair of headphones hung from a hook above it all. A low hum vibrated through the floor, steady like the distant purr of a generator, but Jonas saw no power source. A single battery unit sat beneath the console wires, tucked neatly, lights flickering faintly green. Rook moved along the wall, sniffing each plate, his movements almost ceremonial. When he reached the third panel from the left, he stopped dead. Hackles rose. Tail stiffened. He nudged that panel with his nose and let out a short bark. Jonas approached. The metal felt cool under his palm, but he could feel it subtle like a heartbeat thrumming in stone. "Grandma, what were you building down here?" he whispered. On the console, a label had been taped with careful handwriting, Rock Listener Airy Blackthorn, Vain Rock Listener. Jonas couldn't help a humorless huff. Of course she'd name it that. He slid onto the stool before the console and took a slow breath. "All right, let's see what you were hearing." He flicked the main switch. The hum sharpened. The oscilloscope screen blinked to life, a thin green line trailing across it in steady motion. At first it held almost flat, trembling with mild background noise. Then the pulses started. Spikes, in groups of 3, then 2, then 3 again. The pattern matched what he'd felt upstairs. Rook pressed close to his leg eyes, fixed on the screen as if he too understood the language of flickering lines. Jonas reached for the headphones and hesitated. Last time, he'd willingly plugged himself into someone else's frequencies. It had been through a headset in an armored vehicle listening for chatter that meant ambush. He still woke, sometimes hearing echoes from that channel. He clenched his jaw and settled the headphones over his ears. Static at first, then a low rising sound, the slow, resonant groan of shifting stone. Beneath it flowed a deeper tone, not quite a note, not quite noise, a pressure wave. Subsurface movement translated into sound, and under that, like a second voice trying to break through, came a series of sharper taps. 3. Pause. 2. Jonas's chest tightened. This wasn't random. Something was moving or forcing movement where it shouldn't be. He pulled the headphones off and scrubbed a hand over his face. "Okay, this is not my field." He scanned the console for more clues. A stack of logbooks lay on a side shelf, spines cracked from frequent use. He opened the most recent one. Entries in Evie's compact script marched down the page. Day 4021 pattern stable. Primary vein pressure within expected range. Day 4128. New pulses detected. External frequency. Doesn't match normal thaw cycles. Day 4193 taps increased. Groupings 323. Feels like someone hammering from underneath. Day 4205 trucks from Northline, seen after midnight. Not on county schedule. Vein tone duller by morning. Jonas frowned. Northline. The name tugged at him. He'd seen it etched on the sides of tanker trucks when he'd rolled into town. Mining and energy. Friendly slogans about powering futures. He read farther down the page. "If anyone finds this after I'm gone, the ridge isn't just rock. It carries our water, our heat, our history. Northline is tapping deeper than they say. If they keep drilling into Blackthorn Vein, the slope above town could shear. Listen to the stone. It warns before it breaks. The last entry had been underlined twice. Rook's head snapped up suddenly. He turned toward the shaft ears, razor-sharp body rigid. Jonas lifted his gaze. What is it? A faint rumble filtered down from above, not the broad, gentle noise of wind, but something narrower, mechanical, rhythmic. Tires over packed snow. His stomach dropped. You've got to be kidding me. He snapped the logbook shut, flipped the console switch off, and hurried to the ladder. Rook was already climbing pause, careful but quick. At the top, Jonas eased the hatch open just enough to look out. Headlights swept past the birches, steady beams cutting through snowfall. An engine idled for a moment on the road below the cabin, then revved. The vehicle didn't pull into the drive. It crawled past slowly, like someone scouting, counting windows, noting positions. He caught a glimpse of the logo stenciled on the side panel as the truck turned. Northline Geothermal. Jonas's pulse hammered. They're not supposed to be up here in a storm like this. Rook growled, a low rumble that lived somewhere between his chest and the floor. The truck hesitated at the bend in the road. For a stretched second, Jonas thought it might turn and climb toward the cabin. Instead, it rolled on, disappearing into the trees, taillights shrinking to red pinpricks. Silence washed back in. Jonas closed the hatch, fully heart, still racing. He sat on the floor back against the wall, the weight of the mountain pressing down on him in more ways than one. He looked at Rook. She was onto something, wasn't she? The dog stepped closer, resting his chin on Jonas's shoulder in what felt like an answer. He thought of all the reasons he'd come here, expecting to sign papers, sell the place, and move on. No roots, no complications, no more responsibilities chained to land or people. But Evie's words on the page refused to leave his mind. If they keep drilling into Blackthorn Vein, the slope above town could shear. Jonas could picture the valley, clearly the cluster of houses, the school, the diner where he'd warmed his hands on bad coffee that morning, people who hadn't even looked twice at him. People who didn't know their hillside might be simmering with strain. He rubbed a hand over his face. I don't owe them anything, he said quietly, mostly to himself. Rook didn't move. Jonas heard the lie in his own voice. He'd once sworn oaths to protect people he didn't know in places he couldn't pronounce. Walked away afterward because he didn't know how to come home to anything that steady. Now a mountain he hadn't asked for and a grandmother he barely remembered were asking him to listen when everyone else had decided to tune out. He let his head thump gently back against the wall. We could ignore it, he tried again. Sell the cabin. Walk away. Plenty of places would let us disappear. Outside, distant thunder rolled not from the sky but from deep within the ridge. A tiny shower of dust slipped from a beam overhead, raining onto his shoulder. Rook stepped away, went to the table, and placed one paw firmly on Evie's logbook. Jonas stared at the dog. That's not fair. Rook held his gaze. Something in Jonas's chest, tight and rusted for years, shifted. It didn't loosen exactly, but it turned like a lock recognizing the right key. He pushed himself up, grabbed the logbook, and tucked it under his arm. He pulled on his coat, checked his phone, no signal, and slipped his boots back on. Rook watched every movement ready. Jonas opened the door. Wind knifed through the gap, bringing with it the smell of snow and distant exhaust. If they're drilling where they shouldn't, he said more to the night than to the dog. I'm not letting this place become a casualty. Rook trotted past him onto the porch, ears high, stance sharp. Jonas stepped out into the storm, the cabin at his back, the valley below, and Northline's unseen machines humming somewhere inside the mountain. He pulled the door shut, the latch clicking into place. He had no plan yet. No allies. No proof beyond notebooks and vibrations. But he had a starting point. Tomorrow he would walk into Larkspur and put Evie's warnings in front of someone who couldn't pretend they hadn't heard. Whether they believed him, that was another battle. For tonight, Jonas squared his shoulders against the wind and took the first step down the path, knowing that whatever waited at the bottom would change the quiet life he'd almost convinced himself he wanted. And high above, hidden in the snow and stone, something deep within Blackthorn Ridge shifted again just enough to remind him time was already running. Jonas walked into Larkspur at mid-morning snow, crunching beneath his boots like brittle glass. The sky hung low, thick with a coming storm that promised a harder afternoon. Rook kept pace beside him, gait purposeful, the dog's gaze flicking to every passing car, every face, every truck roue. The closer Jonas got to town, the more the world shifted from wilderness, quiet to civilized noise plows, scraping streets, distant machinery grinding the metallic tang of diesel hanging in the air. Yet even here, Rook's ear, Jonas rubbed the back of his neck, trying to shake the unease creeping under his ribs. Feels like walking into a place that already decided we're trouble. Rook didn't slow. The sheriff's station sat at the corner of Main and Old Quarry Road, a squat brick building with a green metal roof and a single flag snapping in the freezing wind. Jonas stepped inside, bracing himself against the sudden blast of heat from the radiators. The front desk was empty except for a small bell and the faint scent of burnt coffee. Before Jonas could tap the bell, a woman stepped through the doorway behind the counter. Late 30s, brown hair pulled back into a low ponytail uniform, crisp but her expression gentler than the badge suggested. "Morning," she said. "I'm Deputy Marin Pike. What can I do for?" Her eyes landed on Rook first, widening with appreciation. Then she looked up at Jonas, and the softness sharpened with curiosity. "You're Evie Hale's grandson." Jonas blinked. Word travels fast. In a town this size, it gallops. Marin leaned on the counter. "What brings you in?" Jonas pulled the logbook from his coat. "My grandmother kept notes on geological anomalies, pressure shifts, subsurface vibrations under Blackthorn Ridge." Marin raised a brow. Evie always talked about the ridge like it had its own pulse. She wasn't imagining it. Jonas opened the book to a random page. These readings started getting stronger near the time Northline's new drilling started. Her jaw stiffened, not with disbelief, but something closer to dread. She closed the logbook gently. "Jonas, look, I believe Evie was sharper than anybody gave her credit for, but going up against Northline is..." The door slammed behind them. Jonas turned. 2 men entered, shaking snow from their jackets. Both wore Northline badges clipped to their pockets. A third man followed, a supervisor by the look of his tailored coat and expensive thermals underneath. He had the kind of smile meant for public relations, polite, photogenic, and hollow. Marin's shoulders tensed. "Gentlemen." The supervisor's gaze slid over Rook, first lingering with faint annoyance, then rose to Jonas. "Mr. Hale, you're a hard man to track down." Rook stepped forward immediately, placing himself slightly ahead of Jonas' posture, not aggressive but claiming space. Jonas's voice cooled. "I didn't know we had business." "You stepped onto company-monitored land yesterday," the supervisor replied, tone crisp. "Our sensors flagged unusual activity above the extraction grid." Jonas exhaled through his nose. "I walked into my grandmother's home." "That cabin sits near restricted subsurface assets," the man said. "We prefer residents coordinate with us to avoid misinterpretations." Marin stepped in. "Blackthorn Ridge is county land outside your permitted range. You monitor it, sure, but you don't own it." The man's smile didn't falter. "Deputy Pike, we're simply ensuring safety." Jonas met his gaze with steady irritation. "You're ensuring we stop asking questions." Rook's tail stiffened, a silent warning. One of the Northline workers glanced nervously between the dog and the supervisor. "We're not trying to intimidate anyone." His voice wavered. Just here to the supervisor cut him off with a look. Then he extended a business card toward Jonas. "I'm Damon Kessler, Regional Operations." His voice softened, falsely warm. "If you need anything while settling your grandmother's affairs, heat assistance, maintenance, transportation, we can provide support. We want good relationships with locals." Jonas didn't take the card. "You don't want a relationship. You want silence." Kessler's smile thinned. "Careful, Mr. Hale. Misunderstandings create conflict, and conflict wastes time." Jonas leaned closer, voice steady. "Then, stop drilling where you're not supposed to." A flicker passed behind Kessler's eyes, annoyance or calculation, Jonas couldn't tell. He stepped back, brushed snow from his coat, and nodded to his men. "Let's go, we're done here." As they left, Rook tracked them head low, muscles tight. Only when the door shut did he relax barely. Marin let out a breath. "Jonas, if they're scouting you already, you're onto something big." "No," Jonas murmured. Evie was. He pocketed the logbook and turned toward the door. "Where are you headed now?" Marin asked. "To find someone who knows more than I do." Rook barked once, sharp and approving. The Larkspur Public Works building sat at the edge of town, where the asphalt dissolved into gravel. Jonas and Rook arrived, just as an older man stepped out, scarf wrapped around his neck, his breath fogging the air. Dr. Saul Marwick, hydrologist, part-time professor, full-time hermit by reputation. Jonas recognized him from old photos in Evie's trunk. "Dr. Marwick," Jonas called. The man paused, squinted, then frowned. "You look like Evie's bloodline." Sama Yao, Sama's stubborn posture. Jonas tried not to smile. "I'm her grandson." "Terrible sympathy," Marwick muttered. "She left this world sharper than most enter it." "What do you need?" Jonas held out the logbook. "Answers." The older man took the book reluctantly, flipping pages with a speed that suggested skill rather than disinterest. His eyes narrowed as he scanned Evie's handwriting. Pressure wave patterns, harmonic pulses, extraction interference. He closed the book abruptly. Where did you see this? Her cabin. There's a chamber under the floor. Marwick stared at him, color draining from his already pale face. A chamber Jonas the Blackthorn vein runs directly beneath that ridge. If she built listening posts on top of it, she did. And if she cataloged thinning pulses, she did. The man's breath stalled. Then we're running out of time. Rook growled softly, not at Marwick, but at the implication. Marwick pushed past Jonas, pacing in tight circles in the snow. Blackthorn vein isn't just water. It's structural. It holds half the ridge together. If Northline is drilling deeper than their permit, Jonas finished for him. The mountain's going to move. Marwick nodded a small, grim acknowledgement. And it won't move quietly. Jonas felt his stomach sink. So what do? Marwick looked up, eyes blazing with conviction Jonas hadn't expected from someone so weathered. We prove it. We gather readings. Data. Evidence the county can't ignore. Jonas nodded slowly. And then, we pray the ridge listens longer than the company does. Rook barked once, a decisive sound that cut the cold air like an arrow. Jonas felt the old familiar weight settle in his chest, the weight he'd carried through war zones, rescue missions, nights where he'd been the only thing standing between safety and disaster. He thought he was finished with that life. But the mountain had other plans. The wind sharpened as Jonas Rook and Dr. Marwick climbed the service path toward Blackthorn Ridge that afternoon. Clouds massed like bruises over the mountaintops, promising another storm by nightfall. Jonas pushed forward, breath fogging in heavy bursts, Marwick trudging behind with a stubborn rhythm. Rook trotted ahead, nose to the airtail still. He wasn't exploring, he was surveying. Jonas could feel the dog's vigilance in every movement. Marwick tapped the metal case he carried. This monitor will read pressure differential in real time. If excavation exceeds the safe threshold, it'll spike. Jonas nodded. Then let's hope it stays calm. No, Marwick replied grimly. We hope it screams. Calm means nothing's wrong. Screaming means we have proof. Rook barked once, as if echoing the idea of urgency, then bounded up a cluster of stones ahead. Jonas slowed slightly. He's on edge. That dog knows more about danger than most of the council, Marwick muttered. They approached a ridge overlook an exposed shelf of rock where snow had been blown thin. From here, the valley stretched below in a patchwork of forest and white drift. To the west, industrial lights glowed faintly at the Northline extraction site. Marwick crouched and set the monitor on the ground. He flipped a switch. A soft hum filled the cold air. The screen flickered to life, showing a baseline wave that quivered steadily. Now what Jonas asked. We wait, Marwick replied. Pressure anomalies come like bad habits, predictable in their unpredictability. Jonas scanned the tree line. Rook stood a few yards away, tail-stiffened nose pointed toward the east slope toward Evie's cabin. Jonas followed his gaze. Something's up. Marwick looked up sharply. Rook took 3 quick steps forward, body low, muscles tight. Then he froze. Jonas recognized that posture, immediately listening with every fiber. The dog wasn't tracking scent. He was tracking vibration. Jonas stepped beside him and knelt. He pressed his gloved hand to the earth. A faint tremor rippled beneath his palm. Not steady. Pulsed like a heartbeat too fast to be natural. Marwick, Jonas called. Check the monitor. The old man hurried over, breath catching as he saw the screen. The baseline had jumped, sharp, jagged spikes cutting across it like lightning. Pressure rising, Marwick muttered. Damn it, this is not thaw cycle noise. This is mechanical. Rook barked twice, harsh and insistent. Then across the valley, a dull rumble grew low at first, then louder, rolling through the ridge like distant thunder. Marwick's eyes widened. That's a deep drill driver. Jonas felt adrenaline surge through him. Northline. They're breaching the lower segment, Marwick whispered. That could destabilize the entire vein. Rook swung his head toward the slope above the cabin, barking sharply. Jonas stiffened. He hears something else. Marwick pointed at the monitor, which now spiked violently. Jonas, if they're drilling into a fork of the Blackthorn vein, the ridge could shear. That includes the old shaft beneath your grandmother's home. Jonas looked up, the mountain gut twisting. The underground room. The consoles. Evie's notes. Rook bolted downhill, snow kicking behind him. Jonas felt the decision snap into place before thought caught up. We're going to the cabin. Marwick grabbed the monitor. I'm coming. You'll slow us down, Jonas warned. Marwick's expression hardened. I'd rather die on the ridge than let those bastards bury this truth. Rook barked from ahead, urgent. Jonas clenched his jaw. Fine. But stay with me. And if I tell you to stop, you stop. Marwick nodded once. Deal made. The sprint back toward the cabin was brutal. Snow thickened by the minute. Wind lashed sideways, slicing warmth from exposed skin. Jonas and Marwick fought up the narrow trail while Rook darted ahead, then doubled back, guiding them through drifts and ice patches. "Jonas, wait," Marwick shouted over the wind. Rook had stopped again, but not because he was confused. He stood rigid on the path, ears pinned forward, body blocking their way like a living barricade. "What is it?" Jonas asked. Rook growled, low, guttural, rare. Jonas followed the dog's stare. A man stood on the cabin porch, broad shoulders, thick coat, a Northline insignia sewn onto the sleeve. He knocked once on the cabin door, then stepped back, surveying the clearing. Behind him sat a black snowmobile engine still ticking with heat. Marwick whispered, "We can't let him inside." Jonas's pulse hammered. "We're already too late." The man cupped his hands and called Jonas, "Hale, we need a word." Rook stiffened. Jonas placed a hand on the dog's neck. "Easy, Mr. Hale," the man shouted again. "We're aware you've accessed an unauthorized subsurface area. That chamber could be dangerous. We're here for your safety," Jonas muttered. "That's not why he's here." The man turned eyes, scanning the tree line, and locked directly onto Jonas and Marwick. His voice dropped the pretense. "There you are." Rook surged forward, but Jonas caught his harness. "Not yet." The man stepped off the porch, crunching across the snow. "We're shutting down that cabin until Northline can verify structural integrity. You need to hand over any materials your grandmother kept." Jonas descended the trail with a steady, controlled stride. "You can't enter my home without a court order." "This is a safety check," the man said calmly. "Emergencies allow temporary access." Jonas stopped 10 paces away. "And this emergency started when you began drilling." The man's expression hardened. "Mr. Hale, the last thing we want is conflict." Rook growled behind Jonas's leg. Jonas kept his voice low, then stepped away from the door. A tense silence settled cold as the wind whipping between them. Marwick stepped forward. "If your company compromised the Blackthorn vein, sir," the man cut in sharply, "I'm going to insist you leave this area. For your own protection." Jonas realized then the man wasn't here to persuade. He was here to stall, to keep Jonas from the underground chamber, to gather or destroy whatever Evie left. Jonas tightened his grip on Rook's harness. "Marwick, back up." The old man retreated 2 steps. The Northline agent sighed. "Let's make this simple. You hand me the logbooks and I walk away." "No," Jonas said. The man's jaw tightened. "Then we do this." The hard Rook exploded forward. The dog launched with a precision Jonas hadn't seen since their last deployment, straight at the man's arm, jaws open not to maul but to disarm, redirect, destabilize. "Jonas," shouted Rook, "hold." Rook obeyed instantly, halting just inches away, but the agent stumbled back, startled. Jonas stepped into the space. Rook created, voice sharp. "You're done here." The man recovered quickly, breath clouding the air. "You're making a mistake." Jonas took a step closer. "Not compared to yours." The man backed toward his snowmobile. "I'll report this," Jonas said. "And report the illegal drilling too." The man's composure fractured for half a second before he masked it. He swung onto the snowmobile, started the engine, and tore down the trail without another word. Jonas waited until the roar faded. Marwick exhaled shakily. "Jonas, they're desperate. That's when people become dangerous." Jonas looked at the cabin. "We need to get inside. Now." Rook sprinted ahead, leading the way. And as Jonas pushed open the cabin door, a cold certainty settled into his chest. Northline wasn't going to stop. Neither could he. Rook darted straight for the hatch the moment they stepped into the cabin. He didn't pause to sniff the chairs or sweep the perimeter. He went directly to the floorboard. Jonas had lifted the night before and planted himself there, front paws, braced tail, rigid. Jonas's pulse picked up. "You think they've already been down there," Marwick. Shut the door against the wind, shoulders hunched. "If they have, they'll either have taken everything." He glanced at Jonas, "or left something we're not going to like." Jonas knelt, fingers slipping into the recessed handle. The metal felt colder than the air. He hesitated, listening. No voices, no movement. Just the low, constant groan of the storm outside and a deeper, subtler murmur coming through the floor. He pulled the hatch open. Lantern light spilled down the shaft. The iron rungs gleamed faintly. Nothing looked disturbed from this angle, but Jonas knew better than to trust first looks. "Stay close," he told Marwick. Rook didn't wait for permission. He started down the rungs with practiced care nails clicking softly. Jonas followed Marwick, bringing up the rear, clutching the monitor case like a shield. The chamber felt tighter today. Same stone walls, same bolted plates, same console, different air. Jonas smelled it the second his boots hit the ground, a faint trace of cigarette smoke, cold, and recent fought with the mineral tang. "Someone's been here," he said. Rook ranged ahead, nose sweeping the floor, the cables, the console. He stopped at the table where the logbooks had been stacked. The top 2 notebooks were gone. Jonas's jaw clenched. They took some of her records. Not all, Marwick said. He pointed to a lower shelf. Look, several older logbooks remained. Their spines were cracked edges, worn some pages marked with Evie's familiar tabs. Jonas grabbed one and flipped it open. Entries from more than a decade ago filled the pages. Why leave these? He muttered. Marwick's eyes flicked to the console. Because they're not worried about anything that doesn't incriminate them directly. Rook shifted suddenly. He moved along the far wall, head low, ears, splitting toward 2 directions at once, one toward the metal plates, one toward the rock beneath his feet. He whined soft but distressed. Jonas crossed to him. What is it? Rook looked up at him, and then pressed his nose hard against a hairline fracture in the stone near the floor, so fine Jonas would have missed it without that precise gesture. The rock wasn't smooth there. It had been patched. Marwick crouched, tracing the line with unsteady fingers. This wasn't natural. Someone drilled here once, then sealed it, Evie Jonas asked. Marwick shook his head. No. She wouldn't conceal a listening point. She documented everything. He looked up, face pale. This is Northline's work. An old test bore. They plugged it when they realized how close they were to the main vein. Rook backed away from the fracture ears pinned. A tremor shivered through the chamber, subtle but undeniable. Dust shifted from the beams overhead. The monitor case in Marwick's hand bumped against his knee. He flipped it open with shaking fingers, powering it on. The small screen sprang to life, displaying a live pressure graph. The line wasn't calm. It wasn't even steady. It climbed. Pressure's rising again, Marwick said, voice tight, faster than before. Jonas's gaze slid to the console. The rock listener array hummed louder, a faint vibration traveling up his legs. He reached up and set the headphones over his ears again. Noise crashed in deeper, more urgent than the night before. The slow bass groan of shifting stone shoved against a faster pounding rhythm. It felt crowded, like 2 rivers forced into one narrow channel, and under it all, a new sound. Not the 3-2 tapping. Not the familiar pulse. A series of sharp, uneven cracks, like glass under too much weight. Jonas ripped the headphones off. Whatever they're doing out there, they're overloading the system. Marwick studied the monitor face draining of color. This rate of climb, Jonas, if the pressure doesn't have somewhere to bleed off, it'll find its own exit, where Jonas demanded. Marwick didn't answer. Rook turned his head sharply focused, now not on the wall fracture, but on the ceiling, on the rock above them between this chamber and the cabin floor. He backed toward Jonas's leg and sat pressing against him, a rare, childish gesture Jonas hadn't seen since their first months together. Jonas felt his own breath stutter. You think it's going to come through here? Or under the town, Marwick said. Or both. Then we need to shut down their drilling, with what Marwick asked bitterly. Your dog and my broken knees, Jonas looked at Rook. The shepherd stared back, amber eyes, blazing with something that looked almost like a plea, not fear, demand. He thought of the town, of the deputy who'd tried to warn him, the kids slipping on sidewalks outside the diner, the old men playing cards by the window, people who didn't know they were standing on a percussion line. We can at least prove what's happening, Jonas said quietly. We get enough data they can't bury it. Marwick laughed once, a short, humorless bark. You still believe systems listen? No, Jonas said. I believe people do, eventually. Rook shoved his nose under Jonas's hand, and Jonas realized he'd clenched his fist so tightly his gloves creaked. He forced them open. What's our best move? He asked. Marwick stared at the monitor. The line climbed another notch. We take this data to the county council. We show them Evie's logs, cross-reference with live readings, and compare to Northline's permit depths. If we can prove active violation and imminent danger, they have to issue an emergency shutdown. And if they don't, Jonas asked. Marwick met his gaze. Then we find someone above them who will. Rook suddenly stiffened again, not toward the fracture this time or the ceiling, but toward the ladder. Footsteps. Very faint. Snow-crusted boots on wooden planks. Jonas froze, finger to his lips. The 3 of them listened. A slow creak traveled down the shaft. Another. Someone was in the cabin. Rook's body dropped into a silent crouch, eyes on the hatch. Jonas felt his mind click into the hard, clean focus he hadn't wanted to feel again. He glanced around the chamber and grabbed the closest thing to a weapon, a steel sampling rod leaning against the wall. He whispered Marwick. Lights. The older man killed the monitor screen. Jonas reached up and flicked the console switch off. The hum died. The chamber fell into a tight, cold quiet lit only by the faint glow from the shaft. Boots scuffed overhead. A voice muttered too low to catch words, but the cadence was unfamiliar. Not Marin's. Not any local he'd heard. Rook's muscles trembled with restraint. Jonas placed a hand on his flank. "Wait," he breathed. A shadow darkened the shaft opening. The hatch shifted on its hinges, then lifted. A beam of flashlight cut down into the dark. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then a man's voice drifted down. Well, she wasn't kidding. He found the listening room. It wasn't Kessler. The tone was younger, sharper threaded with something like regret. Jonas recognized it after a second, the nervous Northline worker from the sheriff's station, the one who'd tried to speak before Kessler shut him down. Marwick whispered Dean Rudd. "Maintenance tech. How do you Evie mentioned him? Quiet kid. Too good to stay with them." The flashlight wavered. "Mr. Hale, I know you're down there. Your dog just told me." Rook huffed softly as if offended. Jonas weighed his options in a flash. If Northline had sent Dean, it was either as a trap or as a sign of fracture inside the company. Either way, staying silent wasn't an option. He stepped into the beam sampling rod, lowered but ready. "Talk fast." Dean flinched at the sight of him, then visibly relaxed when he saw Rook at his side. "They know you've got this place. They know about her logs. Kessler's pushing for containment measures before any state inspector makes it up the ridge." Marwick hissed. "Containment, that's a neat word for burying the evidence." Dean swallowed. "He's pushing to vent pressure via an old test bore on the far slope. Says it'll stabilize metrics before the audit." Marwick swore under his breath. "If they open that bore, they'll blow a fracture straight toward the southeast face. That's the school side." Jonas felt something cold lance through him. "Dean, when tonight," Dean whispered, "they want to do it under cover of the storm. Blame any ground shift on natural shear." Rook let out a sharp, distressed whine. The midpoint hit like a punch. Evie's quiet warnings, the vibrating charts, the distant drills, all of it converged into a single brutal truth. Northline wasn't just risking a collapse. They were about to cause one on purpose and let the mountain take the blame. Silence held the chamber for one long, suspended breath. Dean's words hung in the cold air like frost. "Tonight, vent via old test bore. School side." Rook paced in a tight circle, nails ticking against stone breath quickening. He kept looking between Jonas and the ladder as if urging move. Jonas swallowed. "You're sure?" Dean's knuckles whitened on the hatch edge. "I heard it in the control trailer. Kessler wants the pressure numbers clean before the state audit. The old bore's outside the permitted zone, so they can't log it. They'll say the storm caused any ground shift." Marwick pressed the heel of his hand to his brow. "Idiots. They're playing chess on a fault line." Jonas's voice lowered. "Why tell us?" Dean hesitated. Then he said, "Because Evie saved my dad's well. Years ago. She didn't have to. She spent nights up here listening, then showed us where the water was thinning. Northline said it was seasonal. They were wrong. She wasn't." Rook stopped pacing and sat beneath the ladder looking up at Dean with startling intensity. Dean glanced down at him. "And, because of him," Jonas frowned. "Rook, you were in that blizzard 2 winters back," Dean said. "The one where the county bus slid off the switchback. I was on it." His voice shook slightly. "I remember the headlights spinning, the weight, shifting, the guardrail giving. I remember thinking, this is it. And then that dog was at the window barking his lungs out while you hauled us out the back." Jonas had filed that rescue under doing the job, move on. Faces blurred. Events compressed. But Dean's eyes held the clarity of someone who'd replayed it 1,000 times. "You saved 11 people," Dean whispered. "You didn't even wait for the news crews. You were gone by the time they rolled up. Like you were allergic to thanks." Rook nosed Jonas's hand, gently grounding him. Dean took a shaky breath. "So if anyone's going to stand in front of that vein for Larkspur, it's you two. And if I keep my mouth shut, that's on me. Forever." Marwick's voice rasped. "Do you have coordinates for this test?" Dean nodded, pulling a folded map from inside his jacket and dropping it down. Jonas caught it, unfolding it under the dim shaft light. A red pen had circled a spot on the southeast slope, not far from a thin line labeled School Ravine. "How long until they start?" Jonas asked. Dean glanced toward the cabin above as if he could see the sky. "Stormfront hits hard around dusk. They'll want cover. 2-3 hours, maybe less. Time compressed." Jonas felt it physically, like the walls sliding closer. Marwick spoke first. "We take this to the sheriff, to the council. They can issue an emergency injunction." "And how long does that take?" Jonas asked. "An hour, maybe 2. If they move fast, Jonas looked down at the map again, at the circled bore, at the ravine arrow pointing toward the tiny square labeled school. He thought of the kids laughing outside the diner yesterday, throwing snow at each other like the mountain was the safest playground in the world. An injunction doesn't shut off a drill that's already spinning, he said quietly. Best case, it lets them prosecute after the fact. After the slope moves. Marwick bristled. You'd rather do nothing, no, Jonas answered. I'd rather get there first. Dean stared. You're not serious. Rook lifted his head, ears pricked. Jonas folded the map, tucking it into his jacket. We don't have heavy equipment. We can't collapse their rig. But if we can physically block them from opening that board, document it while you, he nodded to Marwick, trigger every alarm and official you can. Marwick's eyes flashed. You're proposing what? Standing on the site until they either back down or run you over. If someone's in the way, Jonas said, they can't pretend it was just the mountain shifting on its own. They'd have to log an incident. That brings inspectors with real teeth. That also gets you crushed, arrested, or both. Marwick snapped. Rook stepped between them, tail-stiff gaze locked on Jonas, as if sensing the slope beneath this argument. Dean chewed his lip. They'll be on radios. They'll have loaders, rigs, maybe armed security. You go in alone, they'll plow right past you, or toss you in the back of a truck and say you trespassed. Jonas met his eyes. Then don't let me go in alone. Dean recoiled. I work for them. Not tonight you don't, Jonas said. Tonight you decide who you are when it counts. The words surprised him as much as Dean. He'd spent years trying not to be the man who stepped forward every time a line needed holding. Yet here he was drawing lines in other people's lives. Marwick swore under his breath. We're not equipped for this. We should be handing this to people with authority resources. Authority signed off on their permits, Jonas cut in. Resources signed the contracts. Evie screamed into paperwork for years, and no one listened. We are out of time. Rook gave a decisive bark that bounced hard off the stone walls. The sound jolted Jonas back to a dust-choked street in another country where a younger Rook had barked just like that seconds before a truck turned the wrong corner, seconds before Jonas had shoved his squad behind cover. Those seconds had mattered. He looked down at the dog. You're really not going to let me walk away from this, are you, Rook? Just held his gaze steady and unwavering. Marwick sagged against the console, rubbing his temples. If we go to the bore, I can bring the monitor. If I capture live spike data while they're prepping, it becomes impossible to call it a natural event. We tie it to their activity in real time. Jonas nodded slowly. Then that's our play. You document, Dean. You warn anyone you can in the control room or on the crew who might listen. And I stand where they can't ignore me without making it worse for themselves. You'll be bait, Dean said. Jonas exhaled. I know how to be bait. The admission sat heavy in his chest. He'd been the one to draw fire for his convoy. The one to walk first into blind alleys because he could read angles and shadows. The one who volunteered for the ugly roles because he'd told himself he could shoulder it. It had left him with a duffel bag, a dog, and a life that moved town to town like a ghost. Now the mountain wanted that same skill set. The unfairness pricked sharp and childish. Why me again? Why not one of the people with jobs, roots, families? Then he remembered Evie's first letter, the one he'd almost thrown away when the lawyer mailed it with the deed. If you're reading this, the Ridge chose you. Not because you're special, because you're listening. He hadn't been then. He was now. Jonas tightened the strap on Rook's harness. We don't go in blind, we scout first. If it's impossible, we pull back and scream loud enough that no one sleeps through it. Marwick nodded reluctantly. I'll go to town hall first. Get Deputy Pike any council member with a spine. I'll send them your way. With luck, we meet you before they start the vent cycle. With luck, Jonas echoed. Dean swallowed. I'll get back before my absence raises flags. If I can stall their prep, I will. Rook moved toward the ladder with new purpose tail high, a soldier reporting for duty. Jonas glanced around the chamber one last time. The rock listener array sat silent, but he could feel the mountain vibrating through his bones. A low, unsteady hum like a drumhead stretched too tight. He looked up toward the cabin's ceiling. If we get through this, he murmured under his breath, I'm fixing your damn stove, Evie. You're not haunting me for leaving it clogged. Rook snorted softly, almost a laugh. They climbed. The wind hit them like a wall when they emerged. Snow had thickened into hard, wind-driven shards. Visibility shrank to a gray tunnel. Jonas zipped his coat higher, pulled a wool cap over his ears, and checked Rook's paws for ice before they stepped off the porch. You sure about this? Marwick asked, raising his voice over the gale. No, Jonas answered honestly, but I know doing nothing feels worse. Marwick nodded once, a grim salute, and started down toward town, hunched over the monitor case like it was a newborn. Dean lingered at the tree-line, eyes on Jonas. "If you see trucks heading up ahead of schedule," Jonas said, "get to higher ground. Don't stay in any ravine." Dean gave a tight, frightened smile. "I used to think I'd leave Larkspur as soon as I could. Now I'm thinking maybe I should help keep it around first." "Good start," Jonas said. Dean whistled softly. "Be careful, okay?" Rook stepped forward and bumped his hand as if acknowledging the request. Then Dean turned and vanished into the swirling snow, heading toward the glow of the distant site. Jonas looked down at Rook. "Just us again." The dog pushed his shoulder into Jonas's leg, solid and warm. They started toward the southeast slope. Snow grabbed at their boots deeper with every step. The trail vanished under new drifts, forcing Jonas to read the land by memory and instinct. Rook ranged 10-15 paces ahead, then looped back, checking on him, the storm plastering his fur with white. They crested a low ridge and the world briefly opened. Through a rift in the clouds, Jonas saw it, a cluster of lights on the far slope harsher than any cabin's glow. The silhouettes of machinery, rigs, trucks, angled scaffolds bristled against the steel sky. Northline was already staging. Jonas's stomach knotted. "We're late." Rook let out a low growl, then set off downhill with renewed urgency. Every step now felt like a choice sharpened to a blade. Go forward and risk never coming back. Turn back and live with whatever collapsed behind him. A memory rose, unbidden dust sirens, someone screaming his name through the haze. The one time he hadn't moved fast enough, the one time he'd hesitated calculating risk, and a roof had come down on an allied medic's head. They'd told him later it wasn't his fault, that the structure had been compromised long before. That hadn't changed the way the guilt settled into his bones. The mountain under his boots now felt like that building cracked, aching one wrong push away from giving. He could walk away. No one would know what he'd seen down in Evie's chamber. He'd lived invisible before. He knew how. Rook stopped dead ahead of him and turned. The dog didn't bark, didn't whine. He just looked at Jonas, eyes deep, steady, impossibly clear in the storm, holding his gaze the way he had the night Jonas had signed his discharge papers, and almost walked straight past the shelter that housed him. Back then, the choice had been simple: take the leash or let the dog vanish into an underfunded system. Tonight, the leash went the other way. Jonas's throat tightened. "If this goes bad," he said hoarsely, "you run. Do you understand? You go to Marwick, to Marin, to anyone who will listen." Rook's ears flicked back. He took 2 deliberate steps closer, until his chest pressed against Jonas's knees, refusing even the idea of separation. Jonas rested his hands on either side of the dog's head. The fur was wet and cold under his gloves, but beneath that warmth pulsed steady. "I don't want to do this anymore," Jonas whispered. The admission tasted like rust. "I'm so damn tired of being the one in the open." The wind ripped the words away, but Rook heard them. He leaned harder, just enough to keep Jonas upright. For a moment, Jonas closed his eyes. The mountain hummed under his boots, strained, restless. Somewhere below the blackthorn, Vane pressed against its stone prison, waiting for a release valve it hadn't chosen. He opened his eyes again. "Okay," he said softly. "One more time." He straightened shoulders, squaring against the storm. Rook turned with him, facing the glow of Northline's lights. Together they walked toward the place where the boar waited, where the company's plans and the mountain's patience would collide. And as the first distant roar of heavy engines drifted through the snow, Jonas felt the last of his illusions fall away. There would be no safe sidelines in what came next. Only the line, and whether he and Rook could hold it long enough for anyone else to see. By the time Jonas and Rook reached the lower edge of the southeast slope, the storm had gone from bad to vicious. Snow drove sideways in thick sheets, obliterating the horizon. The world shrank to a narrow tunnel of gray and white. Rook pushed against the wind with his head down, ears, pinned paws, punching through drifts with relentless determination. Jonas followed his lead, using the dog's outline as his only true landmark. Through the blizzard roar, another sound crept in low, at first, then distinct. Engines. Multiple. Deep-throated and steady. They crested a final rise, and the boar site appeared like an industrial island in the storm. Portable floodlights stabbed through the snow, turning flakes into a swarm of glowing insects. A tall rig stood angled over a circular pad carved into the rock, its steel skeleton braced against the wind. 2 tanker trucks idled nearby, exhaust fumes curling in ghostly ribbons. Men in heavy jackets moved like dark ants around control panels and valve wheels. Northline had wasted no time. Rook stopped at the crest body taut. Jonas knelt beside him, squinting through the storm. He counted at least 6 workers, maybe more. A large, boxy generator throbbed near the rig's base, feeding power lines that snaked across the snow. He checked his watch. 4:27 p.m. Dusk would fall in less than an hour. The worst of the storm was expected just after. They hadn't waited for it. A figure broke from the cluster near the control trailer and strode toward the rig. Even through the snow and distance, Jonas recognized the purposeful gait, the insulated parka, a shade too clean. Kessler. He stopped by a large, wheel-like valve fitted to a reinforced pipe leading down into the bore. A technician handed him a clipboard. Kessler signed without really looking. Rook let out a low growl that vibrated against Jonas's knee. "It's now," Jonas said. "This is their vent." He took a breath, felt it burn in the cold, and then exhaled every trace of hesitation he could. "Stay with me," he told Rook. "But if it goes bad, you don't argue. You move." Rook's ears flicked once in acknowledgement. They stepped over the crest and started down into the light. At first, no one noticed them. The wind swallowed their approach, the storm turning them into more shadows in the gray. Then one of the workers glanced up, froze, and shouted, "Hey, heads turned." Voices rose, muffled by scarves and snow. Jonas walked straight toward the central pad posture, upright arms away from his body. Rook trotted at his heel, not lunging, not snarling, but anchored presence undeniable. Kessler saw them and went very still. For a heartbeat, the entire site seemed to pause. Then Kessler found his voice. "Mr. Hale," he called, projecting over the storm, "you're trespassing on an active industrial zone." Jonas stopped just shy of the circular pad. "You're about to open an unpermitted bore toward a school slope." Kessler's eyes narrowed. "You have no idea what you're talking about." "Your own tech does," Jonas shot back. "And so do your pressure readings." Rook stepped slightly ahead, planting himself between Jonas and the nearest truck. His tail was up, his body still. He wasn't attacking, he was drawing a line. Some of the workers shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting between the dog and Kessler. Kessler's jaw flexed. "Our operations are compliant. You're interfering with safety procedures." "This isn't a safety procedure," Jonas said. "It's a cover-up. You vent that pressure here, you'll drive stress fractures right under town." "You're not a geologist," Kessler snapped. "Evie Hale was," Jonas replied. "And your company stole her logs this morning. That enough of a credential for you?" The worker nearest the valve, a man with a thick beard and tired eyes, hesitated, gloved hand resting on the wheel. "We really going through with this in a storm, boss?" Kessler didn't look at him. "We're relieving pressure before it builds beyond safe capacity. This prevents damage." Rook barked sharply, one single explosive sound that made several men flinch. Jonas raised his voice. "You crack that bore and the Blackthorn vein takes the path of least resistance. Do you know what's downhill from here, Holmes? A school. People who don't have a say in your risk calculations." Kessler's face hardened. "You're fear-mongering. Stand down or I'll have you removed." Jonas stepped onto the concrete ring of the bore pad. Rook stepped with him, paws landing with a faint echo. Kessler's eyes widened. "Get off that pad. Open it with me standing here," Jonas said. "Log that. Log the part where you vent into a live human being." The wind shrieked around them, ripping his words into fragments, but the meaning landed. The bearded worker actually took his hands off the valve. Kessler turned ice in his voice. "If he doesn't move, we stop prep until he's removed. Call security from the main site. And get the county sheriff up here while you're at it. He wants a spectacle, we'll give him one." That, Jonas thought, was the first real mistake Kessler had made. Involving outside law meant witnesses, timelines, records. It bought them time, unless Kessler decided to accelerate instead. Rook suddenly swung his head toward the slope above the pad ears pricked. Jonas followed his gaze. Snow on the upper face shifted just slightly. A low, rolling rumble passed through the ground. The mountain was already talking. Kessler felt it too. His eyes flicked toward the slope, then down to the instruments by the rig. Pressure's climbing. "We hold here, we risk uncontrolled shear." "You risk it because you pumped it there," Jonas said. "That's not a natural cycle. That's you jamming the system and blaming the storm." Kessler stared at him. For a brief moment, something like truth flashed in his eyes, not remorse, but the acknowledgement of another man who'd seen the numbers and chosen anyway. "This isn't your war," Kessler said. "Could have fooled me," Jonas answered. The tech at the nearby console shouted over the wind. "Pressure's at threshold, sir. If we don't open soon, we'll lose control of the gauges." Kessler hesitated, gaze bouncing between the screens, and Jonas standing calmly on the bore pad with his dog. Rook shifted his weight, muscles coiled. Another tremor rolled through the ground, stronger this time. Snow avalanched in a minor sheet further up the slope, spilling down harmlessly away from them. The bearded worker swore softly. "Sir," he muttered, "maybe we wait for the sheriff. Let them see the readings themselves." Kessler rounded on him. "You want them shutting the entire field down. You want to walk into town and tell everyone you sat on your hands while their hillside rotted from the inside. We open. That's the only way we show. We're in control." The words weren't for safety. They were for ego, for narrative. Jonas knew the tone. He'd heard it in officers who'd rather push a mission than admit they'd misjudged terrain. Rook's hackles lifted. He let out a low warning growl. The tech at the console called out, panic rising. Threshold exceeded. "Sir, we're in red range." Kessler pointed at the valve. "Open it," he ordered. The bearded worker hesitated. With him standing there, open Kessler repeated voice like iron. The worker reached for the wheel. Rook moved. He lunged not at the man but at the valve itself. His teeth clamped onto the heavy rubberized handle and he planted his paws, dragging it sideways with all his strength. The wheel spun half a notch in the wrong direction, locking under a safety notch. The worker yelped, stumbling. "Hey," Kessler shouted. "Get that dog off there." Jonas stepped off the pad, grabbed the worker's wrist before he could wrench the wheel back. "You saw that," he said, voice low but cutting through the chaos. "He just prevented you from opening in a red zone. You write that down." The worker stared at him, torn. Another tremor shook the ground. This time the bore pad itself vibrated under their boots. The mountain wasn't waiting for anyone's signature. Sirens wailed in the distance, thin at first, then growing. Jonas turned toward the sound. Through a break in the storm, he saw two sets of lights climbing the access road. One larger county sheriff's SUV, one smaller Marwick's beat-up truck, chained tires digging into the slope. Relief hit him so hard he had to steady his breath. "They're coming," Jonas said. "You open that valve now, you do it in front of a sheriff, a hydrologist, and half the town by the time word spreads." Kessler glanced toward the road calculation flickering across his face. The script was slipping out of his hands. The story he thought he could write alone was gaining unwanted co-authors. He raised his voice. "Shut down prep. Secure equipment." The tech at the console sagged with relief. "Copy. Scrubbing cycle." For a second, Jonas thought they'd won the moment. Then Rook's body went rigid in a way Jonas didn't recognize. Not the low anticipatory tension of fight. Not the alert high-focus line of tracking. Something deeper. The dog's head snapped toward the slope behind the rig, toward a section of rock just above the bore that looked to Jonas's eyes like any other chunk of mountain. Rook barked. Once. The sound was sharp enough to crack the air. Then the world lurched. A deafening crack tore through the ridge like a giant splitting a log with a single swing. The ground bucked under their feet. Rook flew sideways, claws scrambling. Jonas hit his knees, catching himself on gloved palms as snow and dirt geysered up around the bore pad. Someone screamed. The rig groaned, metal shrieking as one of its support legs slid into a sudden fissure. "Fault slip," the tech yelled. "We've got a fault slip." A jagged fracture tore open just beyond the concrete ring, racing like a living thing toward the outer edge of the site, toward the side that sloped down into the ravine leading toward town. Time blurred. Jonas saw three workers stumble near the edge, their feet skidding toward the widening crack. One went down hard, sliding on his back hands, clawing uselessly at loose snow. The bore pad tilted slightly, an angle no longer matching the horizon. Rook was already moving. He shot past Jonas and launched himself at the sliding worker jaws, snapping onto the man's thick jacket sleeve. The man shouted in shock as the dog's weight and momentum yanked him sideways away from the crack. The edge of the fracture crumbled, where his legs had been a heartbeat before disappearing into dark. Jonas lunged for the two other workers, grabbing one by the harness strap and catching the second's arm as they skidded. Together, they plunged into a brief tangle of limbs and curses, stopping just short of the edge. For a moment, all Jonas could hear was his own breath thundering in his ears and the mountain roaring under it. Then the rumble softened to a grinding complaint. The crack stopped widening, stabilizing at a jagged meter-wide gash. "Everyone away from the edge," Jonas shouted. Workers scrambled back, some stumbling, some crawling. Rook held his ground, until the man he'd dragged clear found his footing. Then the dog released his sleeve, backing up with a final firm tug, as if to say, "You're not going that way." The man stared at Rook, chest heaving. He saved me. Jonas didn't have time to process it. Another siren wailed closer now. The sheriff's SUV burst into view, plowing through snowbanks as it pulled up short of the pad. Deputy Marin Pike jumped out before the vehicle fully stopped. Marwick climbed from his truck behind her white hair, whipped sideways by the wind monitor clutched under one arm. "What in God's name?" Marin began, then saw the crack, the rig, the workers, Jonas and Rook all in one sweeping glance. Marwick hustled to the edge of the site, eyes wide. "You vented," he shouted at Kessler. Kessler stood near the console face, drawn tight eyes, calculating escape routes even now. "We never opened the valve," he said. "Fault slipped on its own." No, Jonas cut in, stepping off the pad. "Your readings were in the red when you tried. That slip was the vein screaming you'd pushed it too far." Marwick thrust the monitor into Marin's hands. "Look at this. Live capture from the ridge. Pressure spikes correlate exactly with rig cycles. That natural event was manufactured upstream. Kessler snapped. You can't prove operational link without access to proprietary Marin, rounded on him voice like a snapped cable. You're done talking. She turned back to Jonas. You were on the pad, until I saw it moving, he said. Your timing's good. Rook trotted up beside him and sat chest heaving but posture proud. The worker whose life he'd just dragged back shuffled forward, still shaken. Deputy, that dog, he grabbed me. Pulled me off the edge. If he hadn't, his voice cracked. Other workers muttered agreement. Someone pointed at the half-tilted rig. Everything started shaking. Boss ordered us to open right before you showed. Dog jumped the valve, locked it. Marin's eyes narrowed. She looked from Jonas to Kessler. Is that true? Kessler's jaw clenched. He didn't answer. Dean materialized near the control trailer, breath puffing in the cold. His face was pale, but his eyes held a fierce clarity. It's true, he called out. I heard the order. He was going to vent in a red zone before any inspector arrived. I've got internal logs on my phone. I backed them up off-site. Kessler turned on him. You're breaking confidentiality. I'm honoring a town that raised me, Dean shot back, and a woman who kept its wells from going dry. Marin stepped forward, shoulders squared. Damon Kessler, under county authority and pending state review, I'm ordering an immediate shutdown of all Northline activity on Blackthorn Ridge. You will stand down operations, secure this site, and remain available for questioning. You don't have the jurisdiction, Kessler said. The wind whipped the words, but the defiance stayed sharp. Marwick stepped in. With documented imminent hazard and live data correlation, he nodded at the yawning crack. She does. Lights appeared further down the access road, 2 more vehicles, one with a state emblem on the door. Word had traveled faster than even Jonas had hoped. For the first time since Jonas had met him, Kessler looked truly cornered. He glanced at the broken pad, the frightened workers, the dog sitting calmly at Jonas's side, snow clinging to his fur like frost-laced armor. His gaze lingered on Rook, a fraction longer than it should have. This isn't over, he said quietly. No, Jonas replied. It's just going above your pay grade now. Marin called over her shoulder, voice cutting through the wind. Secure the rig, mark the fracture, get everybody off this slope. I want this boar roped off like a crime scene, because that's what it is. As the workers moved to comply, Marwick stepped close to Jonas' eyes, shining behind his glasses. You did it, he said. Jonas shook his head. No, he did. Rook blinked up at him, tongue lolling slightly, listening. Marwick smiled faintly. He gave you seconds. You used them. He looked toward the crack. Sometimes that's all that saves a town. The storm eased overnight, as if the ridge, having made its point, finally allowed itself to rest. By morning, the bore site was wrapped in yellow tape and guarded by 2 patrol cars and a state inspector's truck. News vans had found the service road. Reporters stood bundled against the cold, gesturing toward the tilted rig and the scar of the crack. Back at the cabin, the calm felt almost unreal. Jonas sat at the table near the window, fingers wrapped around a mug of cooling coffee. Rook lay sprawled on the rug, one paw twitching occasionally in his sleep head, resting on Jonas's boot like an anchor. On the table lay 3 things: Evie's remaining logbooks, Marwick's printed graphs, and a thick envelope Deputy Pike had dropped off that morning. Inside were copies of emergency orders, preliminary violations filed against Northline, and a notice of intent from the state to designate Blackthorn Ridge as a protected structural waterway. Near the bottom in smaller print, a note public testimony requested from Jonas Hale regarding events at bore site S14. He traced the words with a finger. Testimony. The thought of standing in front of microphones and committees made his stomach knot, but he knew better than most that silence was its own statement. Behind him, the rock listener array hummed faintly in the chamber below. The new sensors Marwick had installed fed data to a small updated monitor on the wall, a concession to modern tech. The line on the screen now pulsed in a slower, smoother rhythm. The vein was still stressed, but it was no longer screaming. You hear that, Jonas said softly. Rook opened one eye, the mountains breathing normal again. The dog huffed in sleepy agreement. A soft knock tapped at the door. Jonas rose, stepping carefully over Rook's paws. When he opened it, cold air slipped in, along with Marin and Marwick. Marin smiled. We come bearing paperwork and gossip. That sounds like a threat, Jonas said, stepping aside to let them in. Marwick set a small box on the table. From the council, and the school board, and half the town. Jonas eyed it warily. If that's a plaque, I'm leaving it in the box. Rook patted over, sniffing it curiously. Marwick opened the lid before Jonas could protest. Inside lay a simple metal plate mounted on a piece of local cedar. The engraving was clean, unadorned. Jonas and Rook hail for listening when it mattered. Below that, in smaller letters, Blackthorn Ridge Guardians. Jonas stared at it, throat suddenly tight. Marin cleared her throat. I argued for mountain meddlers, but they outvoted me. He tried to deflect with a smile, but it came out crooked. You know I didn't do this for a sign, Good Marwick said. Because no sign is enough. But people need something to point at when their kids ask why the town's still here. Rook nudged the edge of the plaque with his nose, then looked up at Jonas as if to say, That's yours, not mine. Don't start, Jonas muttered. You're on there too. The dog wagged once. Marin's expression softened. The state wants you both at the hearing next month. They'll finalize the protection order then. And one more thing. She pulled another folded document from her coat and slid it across the table. Jonas unfolded it. It was a title transfer, clean official stamped. Not just for Evie's cabin. For the surrounding acreage she'd once tried to buy from the county and never quite managed. Her name had been crossed out. Underneath in fresh ink, Blackthorn Listening Preserve Cooperative Steward Jonas Hale. He looked up stunned. I didn't ask for this. Marin shrugged. Pretty sure that's how inheritances work. What if I mess it up, he asked, before he could stop himself. Marwick chuckled softly. Then the ridge will tell you, loudly, and that dog will drag you back in line. Rook bumped Jonas's leg on cue. For the first time in a long time, Jonas didn't feel the urge to move on to find the next town, the next temporary shelter. The thought of staying didn't feel like a trap. It felt like a mission that didn't end at a border. He rested a hand on Rook's head. The dog leaned into it, eyes half closing in contentment. Okay, Jonas said quietly. We stay. We listen. We keep an eye on the ones who don't. Outside, snow began to fall again, softer this time, flakes drifting lazily past the window like feathers shed from a tired sky. The mountain hummed beneath the cabin, steady, less strained, not silent, never silent. Rook padded over to the hatch, gave it a gentle nudge with his nose, then returned to Jonas's side, and Saturday Jonas understood. Yeah, he murmured. Let's check on her. They descended into the chamber together. The rock listener's screen glowed a calm, rhythmic pattern. Marwick's new sensors clicked intermittently, capturing data for future arguments. Jonas might not have to fight alone. He laid a hand on the central plate, feeling the faint vibration. We heard you, he said, not sure if he was speaking to the mountain, to Evie's memory, or to the part of himself that had finally stopped walking away. Rook circled once, and lay down at his feet, head resting on his boot just as he had in war zones, bus wrecks, and blizzards. Only this time there was no convoy to catch, no extraction time to hit. Just a ridge, a town, and a pulse he'd learned to recognize. And for the first time, Jonas let himself imagine a future that didn't end in departure. The last of the snow melted slowly that spring. It didn't rush. It didn't roar. It simply softened, sinking into the earth like a held breath finally released. The mountain greened from the bottom up, spruce tips, brightening moss returning to the basalt face behind the cabin, the air filling with that clean living scent Jonas hadn't realized he'd missed. Jonas stood on the porch in early morning light, a chipped enamel mug warming his hands. Below him, the valley stretched in a quiet silver mist, rooftops poking through like islands. The school sat just visible against the far tree line, unharmed, unchanged, still humming with the promise of children's voices. Rook lay beside him, chin on his paws, watching the horizon, as if tracking the exact place where night finally surrendered today. The rock listener chamber hummed faintly through the floorboards beneath Jonas's boots. A steadier rhythm now, a calmer pulse. The kind that felt like a mountain settling into healing, not bracing for harm. You hear that, Jonas asked softly. Rook flicked an ear. Not quiet, Jonas said. Just peaceful. The dog let out a low-content sigh. Footsteps sounded on the path. Jonas glanced back as Marwick approached, carrying 2 folders under one arm and a thermos in the other. Even from here, the man's gait looked lighter, as if lifting the weight of the ridge had straightened more than just his posture. You up early, Marwick called. Rook woke me, Jonas replied. I think he's on sunrise patrol. Marwick climbed the porch steps carefully. Good. Someone ought to be. He unscrewed the thermos and poured fresh coffee into Jonas's mug. County Commission approved the preserve, he said. State Board's next, but I've got no doubt they'll follow suit. The testimonies were persuasive. Jonas huffed a quiet laugh. You mean embarrassing. Same thing in politics. Rook nudged Marwick's knee. The older man reached down and rubbed the dog's head with surprising tenderness. You know, Marwick said, I've studied this ridge for 30 years. Wrote papers no one read, filed reports no one answered. Took me that long to understand something your grandmother figured out in half the time. Jonas raised a brow. What's that? That listening is a form of courage. Jonas looked out at the valley again. The sky had turned soft gold at the edges. I didn't listen for a long time, he admitted. Not to people, not to myself. Marwick's voice gentled. But you did when it mattered. Rook pressed closer to Jonas's leg, warm and solid. Jonas took a slow breath. The air tasted clear, clean, alive with the scent of wet pine and thawing earth. Maybe Evie knew I'd end up here, he said quietly. Maybe she understood I needed a place that didn't demand anything from me until I was ready. Or Marwick said maybe she just knew this place needed you. Jonas didn't answer right away. Some truths needed time to settle. A hawk circled high above the valley, its wings carving silent arcs through the warming air. Below, the creek that fed into the Blackthorn vein flashed once as sunlight hit its surface, a living thread returning to balance. Marwick snapped the folders under his arm. Well, I'll let you and your lieutenant here start your day. When he left, the porch grew quiet again. Jonas sat on the top step, Rook easing down beside him, resting his head on Jonas's knee. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Jonas imagined Evie sitting here, once wrapped in a wool coat, sketching pressure maps on scrap paper while the wind carried secrets from the ridge. He imagined her smiling at the thought of Jonas finally hearing what she'd spent a lifetime trying to record. Thank you, he said softly to her memory, to the mountain, to the dog who'd pulled him into a life he never expected. Rook thumped his tail once slow and sure. A breeze rose from the valley, carrying the faintest hum from the earth below. Not a warning, not a strain, just a whisper. Steady, patient content. Jonas closed his eyes, lifted his face to the sun, and let the warmth settle over him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like he was waiting for the next fight. He felt home.